He didn't scream when he hit the water. He told me he didn't have time. 1 second the raft was beneath him, splintering, folding, tearing apart on the rocks, and the next, the Tucci River swallowed him whole. Not the gentle swallow of a calm current. The violent, indifferent gulp of a river that had been carving through the Bolivian Amazon for 10,000 years and had never once stopped to care about what it consumed. His name was Yossi Ginsberg. He was 22 years old. And on that day in November 1981, somewhere deep inside the Madiiti jungle, a stretch of rainforest so remote it doesn't appear on standard topographic maps, Yossi was ripped away from the last human being he would see for 19 days. 19 days. You need to sit with that number for a moment. Not 19 days in a survival camp.
This route crosses the border.
Not 19 days with a radio beacon and a rescue protocol on standby. 19 days absolutely alone, with no knife, no map, no fire starter beyond a cigarette lighter, and no idea if anyone was even looking for him. But here's what makes this case unlike any other survival story in our files. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we've analyzed some extreme ones. This wasn't a random accident. This was the predictable result of a catastrophic trust failure. A con man, a fabricated identity, and 4 young men who paid for their naivety with everything they had. 2 of them never came back at all. To understand how Yossi ended up alone in one of the most biologically hostile environments on Earth, you have to go back to where it began, a hostel in La Paz, Bolivia. 1981. Yossi had been moving through South America for months. He'd worked construction in Norway, fished in Alaska, driven trucks across New York. He was burning through his savings chasing the ghost of Henri Charrier, the author of Papillon, whose book had rewired Yossi's sense of what a life could look like. He wanted the edge. He wanted something real. And in La Paz, he found 3 strangers who seemed to want the same thing. Marcus Stam, a Swiss schoolteacher nursing a broken heart. Kevin Gale, an American photographer from Oregon, experienced with river navigation and originally scheduled to fly home for Thanksgiving. A decision he postponed, a decision that would later save a life. And then there was the 4th man, the one who changed everything. Karl Rupprechter, Austrian, 40-something. He spoke about the Bolivian Amazon with the authority of a man who had spent a decade mapping it. He was a self-described geologist. He said he knew of a hidden indigenous village, a tribe that had barely encountered outsiders. He spoke of gold. He spoke of genuine discovery. And he was extraordinarily convincing. Now, I want you to pay attention to something here, because this is a pattern we've documented before. And if you watched our analysis of the Nutty Putty Cave incident, you'll recognize it immediately. The most dangerous element in any high-risk situation is not the environment. It is a human being who manufactures false confidence in others while possessing none of their own. Karl Rupprechter was that element. He had no geological training. He had no jungle survival experience. And perhaps most critically, he could not swim. A man who could not swim had led 4 people to the edge of the Bolivian Amazon. The Bolivians at the trailhead warned them. The warnings were specific. The dry season had ended. The rivers were running high. The jungle was not manageable for unprepared outsiders. The 4 of them didn't listen. They flew to Apolo, the most remote airstrip in the region, and began their descent into the Madiiti Basin. The first days were intoxicating. The Amazon at that depth is sensory overload. Scarlet macaws cutting through the canopy at altitude, howler monkeys announcing dawn with a sound like distant thunder, the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation so thick you almost chew it. But the Amazon is not hospitable. It is not a park. It is a system, ancient, self-regulating, and entirely indifferent to the biological needs of unprepared humans who walk into it. Within days, Marcus began to deteriorate. His feet had developed trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to moisture that begins with skin maceration and progresses to tissue death. Every step became agony. The group's pace dropped. Their food was running out faster than projected. And Karl, the man supposedly guiding them, was making navigational decisions that didn't add up. The tribe was always just a little further. The goal was just beyond the next ridge. 2 weeks in, Kevin and Yossi confronted him. And that's when Karl admitted it. He wasn't a geologist. He didn't know where the tribe was. He had fabricated nearly everything. The entire expedition had been built on a fiction. They turned back. At the confluence of the Tucci and Ipurama rivers, The group splintered for the last time. Carl admitted he couldn't navigate the river rapids, he couldn't swim. He and Marcus would return overland. Yossi and Kevin would take the raft downstream to Rarenebak, the nearest town. They agreed to meet in La Paz before Christmas. It was the last time anyone saw Carl Ruprechter and Marcus Stam alive. 43 years later, not a single trace of them has ever been found. No remains, no personal effects, no indication of what direction they walked. The Amazon absorbed them completely. Yossi and Kevin launched their raft into the Tucci 3 hours after the group separated. The river was fast, much faster than they'd expected. The canyon walls rose on both sides, cutting off the sky to a narrow strip of blue. And then, from somewhere downstream, they heard it. The sound of serious whitewater is not subtle. It builds from a low rumble into something that fills your chest cavity, the continuous roar that the river generates when it compresses through narrow rock channels and drops in elevation. By the time you hear it clearly, you're almost always already inside it. Kevin screamed at Yossi to get to the bank. They both paddled with everything they had. The current was stronger. The raft hit a submerged boulder with an impact that cracked the entire structure. Kevin managed to leap, to swim, to grab a root on the riverbank and haul himself out, bleeding and gasping. Yossi was not as fortunate. The raft and Yossi were carried forward. And then the waterfall. He went over. In his own account, he remembers the moment of freefall with almost clinical detachment, the way the body processes the impossible by simply refusing to process it at all. He hit the water below, went under, was dragged along the bottom, surfaced, was dragged under again. Rocks shredded his back and shoulders. He fought for the surface for what felt like minutes. When he finally dragged himself onto the riverbank on the opposite side, he sat still for a moment, listening. Kevin's voice was nowhere. Only the river. Only the jungle. He waited 3 days on that bank, calling Kevin's name until his voice gave out. He found no response, no signal, no sign. On the 4th day, Yossi Ginsberg made the decision to walk. He had no choice. He pointed himself in the direction of San Jose de Uchupiamonas, a village he estimated was roughly 2 days away, and he began moving through the most biodiverse and hostile terrestrial environment on the planet. He had one small backpack, a mosquito net, a few handfuls of rice, pocket knife, a lighter, flashlight, a single can of insect repellent, no map, no compass, no survival training of any kind. What followed was not a survival story in the Hollywood sense. There was no montage of clever traps and resourceful fire-making. What followed was a systematic physical and psychological demolition, an education in what the human body endures when it is pushed beyond every boundary the brain was designed to protect. The rice was gone in 2 days. After that, Yossi ate fallen fruit, raw bird eggs scraped from nests, and anything he could identify as possibly non-lethal. He was not confident in those identifications. He ate anyway. The caloric deficit was immediate and severe. His body, recognizing the emergency, began the process we document in metabolic starvation cases. First the fat reserves, then, when those are exhausted, the muscle tissue itself. The organism begins to consume itself to keep the cardiac and respiratory systems operational. The moisture was relentless. The Amazon basin at that latitude maintains humidity levels between 90 and 100% throughout the day and night. Human skin was not designed for continuous saturation at that level. Within a week, Yossi's feet had progressed from uncomfortable to catastrophic. The skin sloughed off in layers. What remained was raw tissue, exposed dermis, subcutaneous fat, the beginning of what medical documentation classifies as grade 3 trench foot. Every footstep was an act of self-mutilation. He began wrapping his feet in sections of his clothing. The wrappings soaked through within minutes. But the insects were something else entirely. If you've never experienced tropical insects in their full ecological density, and I mean full density, not the sanitized version you encounter on a nature documentary, it is genuinely difficult to convey. Army ants, bullet ants whose sting is classified on the Schmidt Pain Index as the most intense of any insect venom, described by researchers as pure, intense, brilliant pain, like walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel. Mosquitoes in numbers that don't register as individual insects, they register as a living atmospheric layer, a breathing cloud that covers every exposed surface. And then, on what Yossi estimates was day 11 or 12, he discovered something burrowed into the skin of his forehead. Botfly larvae. The botfly, Dermatobia hominis, deposits its eggs on the bodies of mosquitoes, which then transfer them to warm-blooded hosts. The larvae penetrate the skin and develop in the subcutaneous tissue, feeding on living flesh. When Yossi examined the affected area with his fingers and the light of his dying flashlight, he counted 20 individual larvae, living inside the skin of his forehead. Using only his pocket knife and whatever steadiness his malnourished hands could produce, he removed them one by one. Each extraction left a small bleeding crater in the tissue of his face. The jungle at night was something his mind was not equipped to process. Total darkness, not the urban darkness of a power outage, but ecological darkness, the kind that exists when there is no ambient light source for 300 miles in any direction. The sounds in that darkness were continuous. The screaming of tree frogs, the bass percussion of nocturnal primates, the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth 20 meters away. And on one specific night, the 6th by his count, something stopped just outside his mosquito net. He turned on a flashlight. A jaguar, 3 meters away, crouched low, tail moving in that slow, lateral sweep that predatory cats produce in the seconds before commitment. Yossi had one functional option. He grabbed the can of insect repellent, held the lighter to the nozzle, and depressed the aerosol. The flame that erupted was brief and improvised and almost certainly looked absurd. The jaguar retreated into the dark. Yossi sat awake until dawn, shaking. And still, somehow, that was not the worst of it. On approximately day 8, crossing what he believed was a shallow section of riverbank, the ground gave way. He slid down a mud embankment he hadn't seen, steep, saturated, vertical. Branches tore at him as he fell. And then a sound and a sensation he describes as unlike anything else in his memory. A broken branch pierced his body. It entered through the rectum. He hung suspended on it, in the air, unable to move, unable to scream. He spent over an hour extracting himself, millimeter by millimeter, rotating his body against the wood, until he could reach a root on the canyon wall and pull himself free. He climbed back to the top of that embankment on pure neurological override. The part of the human brain that governs voluntary action had, by this point, largely surrendered control to something older and more fundamental. The brainstem. The fight-to-not-die mechanism that exists beneath cognition, beneath reason, beneath identity. That same night, he woke inside his mosquito net to movement. Army ants, a column 1,000 strong, on their nightly foraging march, had entered his shelter. They were on his skin, his face, inside his clothing. Army ants don't sting. They bite, and they bite with the mechanical precision of something that has evolved for 300 million years specifically to disassemble soft tissue. He spent an hour removing them from his body. He counted the wounds later. He stopped counting. By day 14, Yossi Ginsberg was no longer operating as a coherent individual. The hallucinations had begun. Sleep deprivation, caloric starvation, pain, and the specific psychological weight of absolute isolation produce a predictable neurological cascade, auditory hallucinations first, then visual, then a dissolution of the boundary between internal cognition and external reality. He began having conversations with people who weren't there. He assigned them names. He developed what he later described as a second self, a companion he called Marcus or Kevin or simply someone, because the alternative was silence, and the silence was finishing him faster than the jungle. On day 3 of the floods, a flash event that raised the river level by nearly a meter overnight, submerging the strip of land he'd been sleeping on, Yossi nearly drowned. Twice. The second time, he sank into a section of riverbank silt that held him like wet cement. He pulled himself free by exhausting reserves he was not supposed to have left. He lay on the surface of the mud afterward and did not move for what he believes was several hours. And then he heard it. A motor. Overhead. Through the canopy, invisible and impossibly remote, an aircraft. He screamed. He waved. He set fire to the most flammable material he had remaining. The plane did not see him. Under a closed rainforest canopy, a man on the ground is invisible from altitude. The sound faded, and Yossi, by his own account, lay down in the mud and prayed for death. Not metaphorically. Literally. He had decided he was done. Now I need you to understand something about what was happening simultaneously several hundred kilometers downstream. Because this is the element that transforms this from a survival story into something that has no rational explanation. Kevin Gale had survived. After 5 days on a floating log, he'd been found by local fishermen and taken to Rarinabak. He went immediately to the Israeli consulate in La Paz. He went to the Austrian consulate. He organized. And it was at the Austrian consulate that he discovered the truth about Karl Rupprechter. The man wasn't a geologist. He was a known grifter with Interpol warrants in multiple countries, a man with a documented pattern of luring backpackers into the Amazon with promises of wealth and discovery, taking their money and vanishing. Kevin organized search parties. He hired a local boatman named Tico. He went back into the jungle. And the local fisherman, who knew the river the way, a face you've looked at for a lifetime, told him directly, "Nobody survives alone in there for this long. Your friend is dead." Kevin refused to accept that verdict. He had one more day planned. One more sweep of the river before Tico told him they had to turn back. And on that final pass upstream, forced by the current into a section of bank they hadn't intended to approach, Kevin saw something on the riverbank. A figure, barely standing, covered in mud and dried blood and something that might have once been clothing. 40 pounds lighter than the last time Kevin had seen him. Eyes open, but barely present. Yossi Ginsburg, day 19. Kevin jumped into the river and swam to him. The geographic probability of that meeting, in a watershed spanning hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, is not something statistics can cleanly accommodate. The current had forced them to that specific bend. The current or something else. Yossi, when he could speak again, didn't call it coincidence. Karl Rupprechter and Marcus Stam were never found. Multiple organized searches found nothing. Not a camp, not a fire scar, not a single personal item. The Madidi jungle holds them still. The Bolivian authorities eventually closed the missing persons files. There was nothing left to close them on. Yossi spent 3 months in hospital. The physical recovery was documented and measurable. The trench foot, the malnutrition, the infection load, the tissue damage. The psychological recovery was slower and less linear. He graduated from university. He wrote a book, Jungle, that became an international bestseller translated into dozens of languages. In 2017, it became a film starring Daniel Radcliffe, a project Yossi evaluated with characteristic directness. The film, he said, is smaller than reality. Everything they showed happened at a reduced scale. The real version was worse. He went back. In 1992, he returned to Bolivia and spent 3 years living and working in the Amazon, helping to build a sustainable ecotourism community with the indigenous people of San Jose de Uchupiamonas, the same people whose river networks had made Kevin's search possible. The jungle that had spent 19 days systematically trying to kill him became, eventually, a place he chose to live. Kevin Gale moved to Israel. He met an Israeli woman, converted to Judaism, married. He and Yossi have remained friends. Kevin is, as Yossi repeats every time he tells this story, the reason the story exists at all. But I want to leave you with a technical question, the one that this case raises and that the survival medicine literature has never fully answered. What is the mechanism? When a human body has exhausted its fat reserves, begun consuming its muscle tissue, been deprived of restorative sleep for 3 weeks, and subjected to continuous pain stimulus, at what point does the organism simply stop? The cardiologists and the neurologists give you numbers. Caloric thresholds, cortisol levels, hemoglobin concentrations below which the brain ceases to maintain coherent executive function. Yossi Ginsburg exceeded all of those thresholds. He kept moving. The technical term in survival medicine is the will to live, a phrase that sounds poetic until you understand what it actually describes. A neurological override state in which the brainstem, acting beneath the level of conscious decision-making, continues to generate locomotor and respiratory drive even after the prefrontal cortex has effectively given up. It is not hope. It is not courage. It is something older than buff. It is the part of the organism that was fighting to survive long before there was any concept of survival. Yossi Ginsburg is 65 years old. He lives in Byron Bay, Australia, with his wife and 4 children. He does not describe what happened in 1981 as a trauma. He describes it as a revelation. The gap between those 2 words contains 19 days of evidence that we are, as a species, far more difficult to kill than we believe. The Amazon is still there. The Madidi Basin is still largely unmapped, and somewhere in that green immensity, two men who followed a lie into the jungle are still waiting to be found.